the disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said, look, they do not do what's lawful on the Sabbath. They're breaking several laws on Sabbath. They harvested the grain. They prepared their meal by rubbing the husk off of it. And so that they were doing multiple different things. And what did Jesus' response was very interesting. Because you think walking through a grain field, that's not going to be a very big deal. You go out and pick an apple off the tree, rub it on your shirt, and then you eat it. That's not a big deal, right? Well, this is what Jesus said. But he said to them, have you ever read where David did what David did when he was in need and hungry, and him those with him? He said how he went to the house of God into the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which was not lawful to eat except for the priest, and also gave them to who was with him. So Jesus is then telling a story about how David had done something that would be considered unlawful for the Jews. But they said, listen, they just ate because they were hungry. They were in need. And then, of course, a passage that we know all well and good, it says, and then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so we see that Jesus placed a very importance on the Sabbath, but not the importance that the Jewish leaders did, because the Jewish leaders basically made it burdensome. You couldn't do really anything. In fact, they would make rules, and then when they try to abide the rules, they would come up with loopholes to their own rules that they had made in order to be able to do more things on the Sabbath that they weren't supposed to do according to their rules, not according to that. And so they lived by the letter of the law instead of the spirit of the law. And so with all this as a background, we don't really know too much about the preparation day other than Jewish custom, because scripturally speaking, the main things that were done on that day was the preparation of food. And of course, in the days of the Jews, it was a little bit harder to prepare food than it is today. You know, when we want to make a meal, we sit there, we put the things together, we throw it in the oven, and then we pull it out of the oven. Well, in the days of the Jews, they had to go out and get the food, pick the food, clean the food, wash the food, cut the food, go out, pick the wood, get the wood, cut the wood. And for those pathfinders who are here that have made fires, it's not as easy to make those fires if you don't have, like, say, a match or a lighter or something like that, because, you know, I don't know how they did it. Maybe they rubbed the two sticks together. Maybe they used flint and steel and stuff like that. But it was much more cumbersome as far as work, and it took away from what Sabbath was. And, of course, in today's age with technology and things, we don't have those issues. But even within the church, when I was first brought into the church, I was given a list of do's and don'ts. You know, I've shared many times some of the things that you weren't supposed to do on Sabbath, and some of the things that I've heard. I said you can't go swimming on Sabbath, but you can go and wade knee deep. Other rules is on Sabbath you couldn't record a sports game on Sabbath and then watch it the next day because you were making your donkey do work. And I've heard all of these different rules and these different regulations, which again were usually done in the academy settings, and it had the meaning of making sure that people kept an honor of the Sabbath, but it always misses the point. Sabbath was meant to be a day of rejuvenation, of moral recreation, to spend time in fellowship and with God. And the principle behind the Sabbath is does it draw you closer to God or does it draw you away from God? One of the things that I thought was very cool, and I'm going to give some practical suggestions on different things that we can do to better honor the Sabbath. Not necessarily rules that if you don't do this, I'm going to come to your house. No. The way that you keep Sabbath is between you and God. But what I seek to do in my own personal life is to enhance that relationship with God myself, because I have felt that sometimes that, you know, I'm almost glad when Sabbath's over because I'm absolutely drained because of whatever's going on. A friend of mine went to Jerusalem and kept the Sabbath with some Jews in Jerusalem. And they have a very distinct way of keeping the Sabbath. Their Sabbath really starts, their preparation for the Sabbath, they do all their cleaning and all that stuff on Friday, and at 3 o'clock, the time of the afternoon sacrifice, is when they start the wind down, right? They start to get ready and welcome the Sabbath. And of course, the sun would then set around 6 o'clock. During the summer here, the sun sets at like 9:30, and it just becomes, and in the wintertime, it's like 5:30, and so it's our time frames are just off. But when the Sabbath would come in, they would have a meal together, and they would actually spend a considerable amount of money having just their Sabbath dishes. That's the only time they used them was for the Sabbath. And they used this as a way to remind them that this day was holy and special and set apart, and it put them in a restful mood. Have you ever come home to a just dirty house? Before you go on vacation, what do you like? A lot of times before you go on vacation, we like to have clean the house so when we come home, the house is clean. I mean, maybe not everybody is like that, but I mean, it's always a really good feeling to have that clean. So what they do is they prepare to ready to welcome the Sabbath by cleaning the house and making sure that the house is clean, the chores are done, that your mind can just relax. One of the things that I know that we like to do is we like to do something as simple as lay out our clothes for the next day, so when I get up in the morning, I ain't got to think about what to put on. Now, for guys, that's a little bit easier than what it is for women because, my wife in principle does this, and then she gets up and she puts it on, and then she takes it off and puts something else on, and it's like until she finds something that she feels comfortable wearing, whether it looks or whatever the case may be. But it's something that helps us to remind ourselves that this is meant to be a day of rest. And not necessarily just an abstaining from work, but to actually have a deeper connection and a deeper relationship with God and with other people. And so we've done several things in our house throughout the years to bring in the Sabbath. We used to, when I was in Collegedale, I would actually make challah, which is a Jewish egg drop bread that was delicious, that I would make the bread, get it to rise, do all that stuff. When the girls got home from school, we'd actually take it and we'd braid it, and they had so much fun braiding the bread like it was hair. And then we would bake it, and then we'd eat that, and then soup in the evening. And we always had something, because the girls always looked forward to doing that. It was something that was very, very unique. It would also be our tradition that we've done many, many times where we would light Sabbath candles. And we'd light 3 candles. The Jews would light 2 typically. We would light 3. One of the light of creation, when God said, let there be light. The second one being that Jesus said he is the light of the world. And the third one being Revelation, when it says there will be no need for the light, Jesus will be their light. And all these things are just different things that we've done in our family to just kind of separate the Sabbath as being something that's special. And it changes the mentality when you're not just working. It's like, oh, it's sunset, I should probably stop working. And then it's not really that rest. My wife, we were talking about this last night, my wife was telling our kids that they would actually, when she was growing up, they would get their whole week to prepare for the Sabbath. You wouldn't overwork, so you'd just be exhausted on Sabbath. The point of all this preparation is to make Sabbath something that is meaningful for us to deepen our experience with Jesus. Because the Bible sits there and says that Jesus is our rest, right? And that we find that rest in him. And then we get into our text for today. And this is in a part where God is actually dealing with not just breaking of the Sabbath, but they were going to the point where the Jews were actually being very cruel to their servants, making them work on the Sabbath. Whereas in the 7th commandment said that you should do no work, neither you, your male servant, or your female servant, nor your donkey, nor the stranger that's within your gates, right? And they were doing these things, and he talked about this fasting because they were doing ritualistic fasting that really meant nothing because they were just downright mean and nasty to their neighbors. And that's another point that we can learn from. We can keep the Sabbath perfectly, but if we're not very Christian in our hearts, what is it going to matter for how we our witness? It's like, yep, they keep the Sabbath, but they're about as mean as something that's very mean. I don't know. I can't think of an illustration of what's mean, but maybe a Chuck when he doesn't have food. I don't know. Is Chuck pretty mean when he doesn't have food, Linda? Oh, okay. So we want to make sure that we get food, but it talks about all these different things about how, their spiritual platitudes were useless because they weren't really worshiping God. They were just kind of doing it as as we say, going through the motions, right? Where God is telling us to just slow down, stop and smell the roses. Just breathe. Have you ever been in a situation where things were really hectic and you just stop for a second, just take a deep breath, and how that clears your mind? That's what Isaiah is trying to address here, is the idea of just stopping for a moment. And then it says, turn your foot away from the Sabbath. That's not really a very good translation of the original. The better thing is don't do the things you shouldn't do because of the Sabbath. Like turn away from your normal routine, your normal works. And then it says, from doing your pleasure on my holy day. This passage has been used far too many times. You can't have fun on Sabbath. The word pleasure was a very poor choice of words from the translator. That word can mean pleasure, but in context, it means from doing your regular business activities. It's basically something that said, don't do business on Sabbath. Don't do what you would normally do. Do something to make this day special. And then it says you should call the Sabbath a delight. And I like this word delight because this word delight actually means much more than just, do something that's nice. It means exceeding amounts of joy. If you're sitting around waiting for the sun to go down so you can go back and do something else, is there an exceeding amount of joy in Sabbath? That's because we have regulated Sabbath to be about rules and regulations instead of about relationships. Our Sabbath school quarter this morning, we talked about being alone, right? And so maybe I talked more than I should have. Chuck let me talk, so you can blame Chuck for letting me talk too much. But it's meant for us to have relationship with others. That's why going to church and fellowshipping together is really, really important. And the Bible is actually quite silent about how that's supposed to happen too. It just said they got together and read the Torah together. And it also said they ate a lot together. Just as a way of reminder, we do have potluck afterwards. Stay and eat with us because eating is a good thing. It's biblical. And it's also, the food is quite good. And I like to eat. Did I say I like to eat? We like to eat. I also like to eat. But we shall call it a delight. Is Sabbath a delight for you? Is it a delight for your kids? You know, it's interesting. When I was at school, I took a class that was called The Writings of Ellen White. And of course, if you're within our church, you understand that Ellen White was one of the founders of our church and wrote a lot of books, and was somebody that was very influential in the church. And this is a scholar on her life and kind of the way she lived. And there's something, and he was sitting there telling us about how, and at one point in time with her grandkids, how they would bring in the Sabbath with pillow fights. And I always sit there and I found that very interesting. We actually started doing that in our household. After we'd have family worship on Friday night, we'd have little pillow fights. Now we have to use the soft pillows because we've got some big heavy pillows that wouldn't make it quite so enjoyable. If you get hit with that, you'd be like, wait, what just hit me? And the kids loved it. And it's something about making it memorable for the children. And I sit there and I think back to her today when she lived in the 1800s. I wonder what the pillows were like in those days. I mean, it seems like that would have been a little bit more. Hopefully they were feather pillows. I don't know. I mean, I picture just swinging a pillow and it just bursting into feathers. Maybe that's just my imagination going a little bit wild. But I thought that was really, really, really cool. And we talked a lot about, in our class, we talked a lot about the history of our church, and that sometimes we get so bent on that the Sabbath should be kept that we forget that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. You see, I think the Sabbath is so much more important today, not just because it's the Lord's Day, which I believe that that's scriptural, but we don't know how to stop. We constantly go. Between my junior and my senior year, my last junior and senior year at Southern, well, because I was a senior for like 4 years, but another story. That's what happens when you change your major halfway through. It takes a lot longer to finish. I went and worked for a friend of mine at his company because they needed somebody with an electrical background. And of course, before I went to pastoral ministry, I was studying electrical engineering. I had my job in the military was an electrical job. I worked on low voltage systems, and I was very good at it, and I knew it very well. And so he asked me to come and help him because they had a problem with one of their systems, and he said their engineer was choice word, not very good. Okay, and he sat there and says, "I know that you know what you're doing. Could you come and help us do this?" And so I did, and I went and I started, and I examined their system that worked, and then I examined their system that didn't work, and I actually had to draw up schematics for this because they didn't have schematics because their engineer just said, well, let's just keep plugging things that work. I don't understand how he was an engineer. I really don't. Because engineers typically have plans, and plans are important when you're building a machine. When you're building anything, it's important to have plans. You don't go and build a house and say, well, I think we need to put a floor down. Let's build some walls, and let's just see if it all goes together. Chuck, would your house have finished that way? Did you have plans when you built your house? You had plans. Plans are important, and they didn't have that. And so I got very frustrated. And I was working out, and I was trying to figure out and try to draw these schematics and try to figure out what went to what and where was the power inputs and where was the logic, all this different technical jargon, basically trying to make sure this thing worked. And when you're working on in electronics, you have something that's called lockout, tagout, where you lock something down, like the power box, and you lock it and you put a tag on it and say, hey, don't use this. I'm working on another part. If you turn this on, you're going to electrocute me. It was much more technical language. That's basically what it said. And so there was another guy that was working there that needed to test something on his side of the system, and I had it locked out because I was working on something that I didn't want to electrocute myself. And he found a pair of bolt cutters, cut the bolt off, turned the power on, and lo and behold, I had some very frizzy hair. and it hurts. And I'm like, and I'm just sitting there and I'm walking around like, it really, I actually saw like the stuff go into my hand and like it paralyzed my arm up to like my joint. And I'm just sitting there trying to shake out my hand to try to regain feeling on this. And then my best friend, who's known me since 8th grade, came up to me and was just looking at me with this strange look. And I'm like, well, what's wrong, John? And he's like, you didn't say one cuss word. I'm like, that's what you noticed? That's what you noticed? And he's like, well, and you're still standing here and not over there at, I won't say the person's name, giving him a piece of your mind and maybe a piece of other parts of your body that were connected to your arms. I'll let you make the inferences. How? You see, you have to understand, I was a pretty violent teenager and even young adult. I fought a lot, and sometimes just for the fun of it. I wasn't necessarily a good fighter, and I lost quite a bit, but I enjoyed exchanging punches and these different types of things. And he says, how? And I'm like, well, my life is different now. I've given my life to Jesus. Like, yeah, that Jesus stuff, I understand, but how? Like, how does that impact your life? And I'd start to explain that, every morning I get up, I read my Bible, I pray, I ask God to give me the guidance and strength throughout the day. One day a week, I take the time off to go and spend time not only at church, but to disconnect from things so I can connect with God and connect with other people. And this rejuvenates my batteries, and it really has given me a lot more patience. And fortunate enough, God is still working on me in that patience area, but I've come a long, long way. You wouldn't recognize the person I was when I was in my early 20s, my late teens, early 20s. And he says, this Sabbath thing sounds interesting. Tell me more. I didn't sit down and show him that the Sabbath was established in the Garden of Eden, not on Mount Sinai, which I could have. I didn't show him how God fed the Israelites for 40 years as a sign for them to continually understand what the Sabbath kept keeping meant. I could have. I could have showed him how Jesus kept the Sabbath according to his custom in Luke. I could have sat there and said how Paul went into the synagogue on Sabbath after Jesus' crucifixion, continuing to teach, and that the Gentiles would ask him to come back on Sabbath, not just the Jews to come back, because they understood that that was the day. I could have pointed to Isaiah, where Isaiah sits there and says that the Sabbath would be kept. I didn't say any of that. I didn't give him a Bible study on Sabbath. I just simply told him how my life was changed because of the Sabbath experience. And he sat there and says, you know what, I'm going to do that this weekend. So he went home. I was still with him that weekend. He went home, and he turned his television off. That doesn't seem like a very big deal to most of us. That's the first time his TV had been off in like 5 years, because he never turned it off. Even when he wasn't home, his TV was running. It always ran. When he was talking with his wife, it ran. When he was doing something, it was on. And he turned it off for that weekend and just breathed. Now, I can't say he's a Sabbath keeper to this day, but he told me afterwards, like, that was the most blessed experience that I had ever had, of just disconnecting. You see, Sabbath was not meant to be a binding. God knows that we work too much. We do too much. He told us to prepare for the day, not just because so we shouldn't break it, because that's the way the Jews got. They did things on Friday so they wouldn't break the Sabbath. But the spirit of the Sabbath is not just turning away from doing your own thing in your own business. It's making the Sabbath a delight. And that's the reason we prepare for it, is so we don't have to worry. If you prepare your food on Friday, then you don't have to worry about what you're going to eat. I can tell you, when we don't do that, when we come home from church, we're all hungry and like, what are we going to eat? And we can't figure out what to eat, and then it takes another 20 minutes to figure out what we're going to eat, and then we're all getting hungry, and then we're all kind of, and that usually is me, I'm not trying to put that off my wife and kids. That's usually me, because I get really angry if I get too hungry. I'm not very hungry, so nobody sit there and say, Pastor, go first at potluck. No, I'm fine, okay? Just so, I know Linda would try to say, Pastor, go ahead. We don't want you angry. And I'm sorry, I pick on Chuck and Linda a lot. Maybe I should do Charlene a little bit more, since Dennis isn't here, to make her feel a little bit more not left out. But what I'm trying to share with you is something that I feel is really important, is that Sabbath is just more about the day of the week and coming to church. Everyone here is going to keep Sabbath differently. What Sabbath means to you and the way that you keep and honor God's Sabbath is completely between you and God. If you're being blessed or being a blessing to others, then it's probably a good thing. I'm going to end with this story that I read. I don't remember if it was in the Sabbath School Quarterly or if it was just in a book that I was reading, but it was about a little church in rural Georgia, I believe it was. And the pastor had this evangelism series, and they'd have a meeting every single year, and this was the first year that they had a visitor come. And in this year, this visitor came, and he came to all the meetings, and he ended up getting baptized. The church rejoiced because they had not had a baptism in years, even though they had done evangelism year after year after year. They wanted to. They tried to do these things. Well, this guy was new to the whole Sabbath experience, and he didn't understand it, so he wanted to say, what can I do on Sabbath? Now, he was a plumber. And so he went out after church, and he went to people of low income, and he knocked on their door in an area that was very low income and says, hey, do you have any plumbing problems I can fix for you? And like, well, we can't afford that. It's like, no, I'm wanting to do this for you for free. He donated the time, he donated the materials, and he did all this work. And came back at the church. After about 2 or 3 weeks, somebody came up to him and said, what you're doing on Sabbath is wrong. You're breaking the Sabbath by doing this. And he's like, I feel very strongly that I'm not, that this is something that God has called me to do. And he kept doing it. Well, they kind of let it go, which I'm really glad they did. Next year, the pastor held an evangelism series. The church was packed. They didn't do anything different with the marketing. They didn't do anything differently. And they come to find out the people that came were the people that this guy went to and worked on their homes. They said they saw Jesus in this guy and they wanted more of what he had. And they came. And the church had like 20 or 30 baptisms in that meeting. It was all because he looked at the Sabbath differently than what people who maybe have grown up in it have looked at it. It's a time to do good and it's a time to honor Jesus. He didn't make any extra money on this and he didn't do all these different things, but it was something he loved his job. He loved being a plumber. And he was able to take something he was passionate about, something that he was good at, and be able to give his talents to the Lord. What does keeping the Sabbath mean to you? The principles to remember is stop and breathe. Just breathe. We live in a very fast-paced world where things are always going on. We need to stop. God knows that we need Sabbath. It was made for us to stop. Secondly, how can we be a blessing to other people on the Sabbath? Now that, I'm not saying, okay, go this afternoon and start fixing somebody's plumbing. Especially if you're not a plumber, you probably really shouldn't do that. You're going to probably cause more problems than not. So Charlene, don't go over and try to fix some of your next door neighbor's plumbing, unless you're a good plumber. Are you a good plumber? No? Okay, then you probably shouldn't do that. But how can we be a blessing to other people? There's times that we just need to rest. Go home and do the joke of lay activities where you just lay down. There's times that you need that. There's times when going out on a ride, a bike ride. When we went out for that bike ride, that was one of the biggest blessings for me. It was tough, but man, riding by that stream, ask any of those Pathfinders what that stream was like. And that bubbling water that went through the whole time. I'm sitting there thinking, man, I was doing that ride and I was just sitting there and hear the water. And there's times the water was very quiet and I had to concentrate on that water to keep me going. And there was times that water was loud and it was just like white water. It was gorgeous. I love water, and so that's why I focus on water with that one. I enjoy the water. Is Sabbath a delight for you? Or is it a burden? If it's a burden, reevaluate your idea of understanding what Sabbath is, because it was never meant to be that. If you've never kept the Sabbath, try it. Try just stopping, just breathing. Our closing song this morning is actually a song that's called Just Breathe. It's by Johnny Diaz, and we're going to play the video in just a moment for you. But I want you to sit there and think about our fast-paced world that we live in. And what does it mean to stop and just breathe in Jesus? I know that people sit there and say, well, you can do that at any point in time, but stopping for an actual 24-hour period of time to do this, in addition to stopping on an occasion to do this during the week, it changes things. it helps you de-stress. Because stress physically is not good for you. So as we close here, I want us to just kind of meditate on the words of this song as it plays. Stephen?
Alarm clock screaming, bare feet hit the floor. Yeah, it's off to the races, everybody out the door. I'm feeling like I'm falling behind, it's a crazy life. 90 miles an hour, going fast as I can, trying to push a little harder, trying to get the upper hand. So much to do in so little time, it's a crazy life. It's ready, set, go, it's another wild day when the stress is on the rise. In my heart I feel you say, just breathe, just breathe. Come and rest at my feet and be, just be. Chaos calls, but all you really need is to just breathe. Third cup of Joe just to get me through the day. Wanna make the most of time, but I feel it slip away. I wonder if there's something more to this crazy life. I'm busy, 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 and it's no surprise to see that I only have time for me, me, me. There's gotta be something more to this crazy life. I'm hanging on tight to another wild day when it starts to fall apart. In my heart I hear you say, just breathe, just breathe. Come and rest at my feet and be, just be. Chaos calls, but all you really need is to take it in, fill your lungs, the peace of God that overcomes. Just breathe. Let your weary spirit rest. Lay down what's good and find what's best. Just breathe. Just breathe. Just breathe. Come and rest at my feet and be, just be. Chaos calls, but all you really need is to just breathe.
Things that were good. They weren't necessarily bad. But one of the last lines there that really hit home is put down good for what is best. Jesus told told Martha that Mary was seeking the one thing that was needed, and that was to be with Jesus. Make sure that we're spending time with him. Father in heaven, I know that many times that I have broke the spirit of the Sabbath, Lord, by stress and worry, by wondering, even ministry-wise, what am I going to do this next week? How can I do this better? And it's often easy for me, Lord, to just go, to stop and actually breathe, to stop and actually remember what you've done for me personally. I just thank you for that. Every one of us here is going through something. I know that this life is a very fast-paced life, and some of us have learned how to slow down. Some of us still need to learn that lesson, Lord, and I'm one of them. I pray that you'll help me to learn to slow down, to enjoy Sabbath, that you gave this for me as well. I pray if there's anybody here, Lord, that hasn't experienced that Sabbath rest or a Sabbath rest in some time, that yes, we come to church, we do that, but we haven't really rested, Lord. I pray that you'll help us to do that. Lord, help me to do that. Help me to be the example, Lord, that I can stop for a minute and just breathe. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you all. Have a blessed Sabbath, and we have a fellowship meal afterwards.